The Pacific War was not merely a conflict between two nations. It was a collision of two fundamentally alien civilizations, two opposing philosophies of war, and two irreconcilable concepts of the individual soldier's role in battle. To understand why the Imperial Japanese Army developed a specific and potent disdain for the United States Marine Corps, we must first establish the foundational principles that guided Japanese military conduct. The core of the Japanese soldier's identity was the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, promulgated in 1941. This document was more than a set of rules. It was a spiritual manifesto. It codified the ancient samurai ethic of Bushido for the modern soldier, placing supreme value on honor, duty, and a conscious contempt for death. The most famous and consequential passage was its unequivocal stance on surrender. Do not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner. Die and leave no trace of your body behind. This was not mere rhetoric. It was a doctrinal pillar. Surrender was not just a personal failure. It was a betrayal that brought eternal shame upon one's family, one's unit, and the emperor himself. A soldier's ultimate purpose was to die for the emperor, a figure considered divine. This created a tactical reality that Allied forces, particularly the Americans, had never before encountered on such a scale. Japanese soldiers were conditioned to fight to the last man. A unit that had lost 90% of its strength was often still considered a viable fighting force, capable of mounting a final, suicidal banzai charge. This mentality granted the Japanese a terrifying defensive tenacity. It meant that every bunker, every cave, every pillbox had to be destroyed completely, as its occupants would almost never surrender. This ethos was married to a specific tactical doctrine perfected during the war in China. The emphasis was on the offensive spirit, the Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, which was believed to triumph over superior materiel. Night attacks were favored to negate American firepower advantages. Infiltration tactics, where small groups would slip through enemy lines to attack command posts and artillery positions, were a standard part of their playbook. Their initial defensive strategy relied on defeating an amphibious assault at the waterline in a brutal, decisive struggle on the beaches. They believed that no force could sustain the morale required to land under such intense fire and push inland. When the United States Marine Corps began its island-hopping campaign, it represented the absolute antithesis of this Japanese warrior ideal. The Marine Corps was not a spiritual entity. It was a professional, technical, and brutally practical instrument of war. Its strength was not derived from the immutable spirit of its individual Marines, but from a system, a combined arms system of overwhelming, industrialized violence. The Marine did not seek a heroic individual death. He was part of a machine designed to accomplish an objective and, crucially, to live to fight the next battle. The difference started at the most fundamental level, logistics and firepower. A pre-war Japanese infantry battalion was a lightly equipped force. Its organic firepower consisted primarily of the Arisaka rifle, light machine guns like the Type 96, and a limited number of mortars and infantry guns. It lacked the ubiquitous rapid-fire capabilities that would become standard for its American counterparts. The U.S. Marine Rifle Squad, by contrast, was built around the semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle, BR. While the Japanese soldier was operating a bolt-action rifle, requiring him to work the bolt between each shot, a Marine could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. A single Marine squad could generate a volume of fire that was simply impossible for a comparable Japanese unit. This was not a matter of courage. It was a physical, technological disparity, but the individual rifle was only the beginning. The Marine Corps' true character was expressed in its integration of supporting arms. The Marine was not an isolated warrior. He was the forward observer for a vast, behind-the-lines killing apparatus. This system began with the 81mm and 60mm mortars, organic to the rifle battalion itself. It extended to the regimental weapons companies with their heavy 30 and 50 caliber machine guns. And it reached its zenith with the artillery of the 11th Marine Regiment, which could lay down coordinated, devastating barrages of 75mm and 105mm howitzer fire on pre-planned points or called-in targets. This was combined with direct fire support from M4 Sherman tanks and, uniquely, the close air support provided by Marine aviators flying F-4U Corsairs and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, who specialized in bombing and strafing just yards ahead of advancing infantry. This combined arms approach was a foreign language to the Japanese military doctrine, which often failed to effectively coordinate its infantry, artillery, and armor. The American method was systematic, relentless, and impersonal. It sought to destroy the enemy not through a contest of wills, but through the application of superior physics and coordination. The Japanese soldier, conditioned to believe that his spirit could overcome material disadvantage, found himself on the receiving end of a storm of steel that was utterly indifferent to his fervor. The initial Japanese contempt for the Americans, whom they often considered soft and decadent, quickly curdled into a frustrated and hate-filled respect when they witnessed the cold, mechanical efficiency with which the Marines fought. The first and most profound shock was the realization that the Marine would not break. He would not be defeated at the waterline. He would land, he would endure the initial fury, and then he would begin the methodical, grinding process of annihilation. The Battle of Tarawa, fought over 76 hours in November 1943, was a traumatic awakening for both the United States Marine Corps and the Imperial Japanese Navy. For the Japanese, it was the brutal, unequivocal demonstration that their defensive doctrine was fundamentally flawed. For the Marines, it was a blood-soaked lesson in the new, horrific reality of amphibious assault against a deeply entrenched, fanatical enemy. The battle served as a catalyst that forged the modern Marine Corps and cemented the Japanese view of the Marines as a uniquely formidable and ruthless opponent. The Japanese commander on Tarawa, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, boasted that 1 million Americans cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence was rooted in the island's natural and man-made defenses. Betio, the main islet, was a fortress. It was surrounded by a shallow reef, a concrete seawall, and a complex network of barbed wire, beach obstacles, and mines. The centerpiece of the defense was an interlocking system of over 500 pillboxes, bunkers, and gun emplacements. These were not flimsy structures. They were built from coconut logs reinforced with steel I-beams and layered with sand and coral, making them incredibly resilient to naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The 4,800 defenders, predominantly the elite Special Naval Landing Forces, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, were well supplied and prepared to die. The American plan, Operation Galvanic, relied on a massive preliminary bombardment from battleships and carrier aircraft to neutralize these defenses. This was the first critical failure. The bombardment, while immense, was too short and, due to communication and doctrinal limitations, insufficiently targeted. A significant number of Japanese fortifications and their heavy weaponry survived. The second, a near-catastrophic failure, was the miscalculation of the tide. The landing craft, expecting a high tide to carry them over the reef, found themselves stranded hundreds of yards from the beach. This forced the Marines of the 2nd Marine Division to wade ashore through chest-deep water under relentless machine gun and artillery fire. It was a slaughter. The sea turned red. Entire boat teams were annihilated before they could even reach the sand. This moment, the wade to the beach, is central to the Japanese perception. From their fortified positions, the Japanese defenders saw American Marines advancing slowly, methodically, through a killing zone that should have broken any force. They saw them take horrific casualties, watch their comrades die beside them, and yet continue to press forward. This was not the behavior of a materialistic, weak-willed enemy. This was a display of cold, grim determination that directly challenged the Japanese monopoly on sacrificial courage. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they would die. The Marines fought with the determination of men who intended to win despite the cost. Once ashore, the battle devolved into a close-quarters nightmare. The Marines did not attempt heroic massed charges. Instead, they developed and implemented the tactics that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Small fire teams became the essential unit of combat. A typical assault on a Japanese pillbox involved a carefully choreographed sequence. 1 or 2 fire teams would lay down a base of suppressing fire with rifles, bars and machine guns, pinning the defenders and forcing them to keep their heads down. Meanwhile, a separate team would maneuver, crawling and darting from cover to cover to get close to the emplacement. The final blow was delivered with explosives, satchel charges, pole charges, or, most effectively, flamethrowers. The flamethrower, in particular, became a symbol of the Marine Corps' terrifying practicality. It was a weapon that did not just kill, it incinerated, and it created a primal fear in the defenders. The Marines also demonstrated a critical flexibility at Tarawa. When centralized command and control broke down in the chaos of the first day, small unit leaders, corporals, sergeants, and lieutenants took initiative. They formed ad hoc units from different companies and regiments and began the slow, yard-by-yard process of clearing the island. They used tanks as mobile pillboxes, engineers as demolitionists, and their own riflemen as the anvil against which the Japanese were crushed. The Japanese, by contrast, were rigid. Admiral Shibasaki was killed early in the battle when his command post was destroyed, and without his central leadership, the Japanese defense lost coordination. Their pre-planned, static defense could not adapt to the decentralized, aggressive tactics of the Marines. The aftermath of Tarawa was a shock to the American public, with nearly 1,000 Marines killed and over 2,000 wounded in less than 3 days. But for the Japanese High Command, analyzing the battle from a distance, the implications were dire. Their defensive doctrine had failed. The Americans had taken an impregnable fortress. More importantly, they had done so not by outspiriting the Japanese, but by outfighting them with a combination of individual courage, small unit initiative, and overwhelming applied violence. The myth of the invincible Japanese fortress was broken. The image of the U.S. Marine as a relentless, flame-wielding engineer of destruction was born. Tarawa taught the Japanese that the Marines were not just another military unit. They were specialists in a specific, brutal form of warfare for which the Imperial Japanese military had no easy answer. The performance of the United States Marine Corps in battle was not an accident of personality. It was the direct product of a deliberate institutional process designed to erase individualism and replace it with a collective identity built on competence, aggression, and unwavering loyalty to the Corps and one's fellow Marines. This process began at the recruit depots at Parris Island and San Diego, and it created a soldier psychologically and physically distinct from his counterparts in the U.S. Army or the Japanese military. The Marine Corps of World War II was a small, elite force. At its peak, it numbered about 485,000 personnel compared to the U.S. Army's millions. This allowed for a more selective and intensive training regimen. The goal of Marine Boot Camp was not merely to teach military skills, it was to effect a fundamental psychological transformation. The process was one of controlled brutality. Drill instructors systematically broke down the civilian identity of the recruit through relentless physical exertion, intense psychological pressure, and an unwavering emphasis on discipline. The purpose was to instill instant, unthinking obedience, a reflex that would save lives in the chaos of combat. This differed significantly from Japanese training, which was also brutal, but with a different focus. Japanese training emphasized endurance, suffering, and the cultivation of the Yamato Damashi. It involved severe physical beatings and focused heavily on bayonet fighting and spiritual conditioning. The goal was to produce a soldier who despised the enemy and valued death over surrender. Marine training, while physically punishing, was more technical and pragmatic. Its goal was to produce a soldier who could kill efficiently and survive. The core of this was marksmanship. Every Marine, regardless of his eventual military occupational specialty, was trained first and foremost as a rifleman. The phrase "every Marine a rifleman" was a foundational truth. They spent countless hours on the rifle range, learning to fire the M1 Garand with expert precision. This created a force where even cooks, clerks, and drivers could be formed into an effective infantry unit in a crisis, a flexibility the Japanese military did not possess. Beyond marksmanship, the training focused on instilling a small unit cohesion that was the bedrock of Marine tactics. From the beginning, recruits were taught to identify not as individuals, but as part of a fire team, a squad, and a platoon. Their survival depended on the man next to them. This fostered a level of trust and interdependence that was far more profound than the top-down, authority-based cohesion of the Japanese military. A Japanese soldier was expected to die for the emperor. A Marine was expected to fight for the man in the same foxhole. This created a different kind of resilience, one based on mutual survival rather than sacrificial ideology. The institutional culture of the Marine Corps also cultivated a unique identity that set its members apart. The distinctive dress blue uniform, the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem, the rich history of the Corps from the halls of Montezuma to the Boxer Rebellion, all of it was drilled into recruits to create an intense pride and esprit de corps. Marines were taught to believe they were the best, the toughest, the first to fight. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. When a Marine landed on a beach in the Pacific, he did so with the weight of the entire Corps on his shoulders. To fail, to falter, was to betray not just his country, but the legacy of every Marine who had come before him. This institutional pride was a powerful combat multiplier. The result of this system was a soldier with a specific psychological profile. He was aggressive, but it was a controlled aggression, channeled through the doctrine of fire and maneuver. He was disciplined, but capable of independent action when his leaders fell. He was a technician of his weapons, from his rifle to the flamethrower he might be called upon to operate. He was above all a pragmatist. His goal was to complete the mission and live, and the Corps had given him the tools and the mindset to do exactly that. When the Japanese soldier, conditioned by his own harsh training, encountered this product of the Marine Corps machine, he faced an enemy whose will was as strong as his own, but whose methods were more technologically advanced, tactically flexible, and devastatingly effective. The Marine was not a spiritual fanatic. He was a professional killer, and the Japanese military, for all its own brutality, came to recognize the difference. The tactical confrontation between the US Marine and the Japanese soldier was, at its core, a battle of ranges. The Japanese doctrine of the final defensive line, centered on deeply fortified bunkers and caves, was designed to force the enemy into a close-quarters killing ground where Japanese spirit and bayonet skill would prevail. The Marine Corps' response to this challenge was not to avoid close combat, but to dominate it with a suite of specialized weapons that transformed intimate ranges from a domain of the samurai into a realm of industrialized terror. This arsenal redefined the nature of infantry combat and became a primary source of Japanese fear and loathing. The centerpiece of this close-in arsenal was the flamethrower. While other armies used flamethrowers, the Marine Corps integrated them into the infantry squad as a standard tool for bunker clearance. The M22 flamethrower was a brutally simple weapon. It projected a stream of jellied gasoline, napalm, that could reach out 40-50 yards. Its effect was multifaceted and psychological. Physically, it incinerated everything within its cone of fire, sucking the oxygen out of enclosed spaces and cooking alive those it touched. But its psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. The sight of the flowing flame was terrifying. The weapon created an uncontrollable, primal fear that could break the will of even the most determined defenders. For Japanese soldiers conditioned to face bullets and shrapnel, the flamethrower represented a form of death that was horrific and unstoppable. The operator himself, the demolitions man, or simply the flamethrower, became a marked target. but his presence on the battlefield often caused a localized panic among Japanese troops. Complementing the flamethrower was a weapon that had been banned by international treaty before the war, the shotgun. The Marine Corps procured the Winchester Model 97 and Model 12 trench shotguns. In the confined spaces of jungle fighting, on the approaches to a bunker, or during the clearing of a trench network, the shotgun was devastating. Loaded with .00 buckshot, it fired a cloud of 9.33 caliber pellets with each trigger pull. At close range, this pattern was impossible to miss and had the stopping power to drop multiple attackers. It was the ultimate instrument for the chaotic, close-quarter work that defined the island campaigns. For Japanese soldiers trained in bayonet combat, the shotgun negated their skill entirely. A single Marine with a shotgun could hold a trench against a banzai charge more effectively than a man with a rifle. The distinctive sound of a shotgun being pumped and fired became an auditory signal of the close-in, merciless fighting that the Marines excelled at. The third pillar of this triad was the demolitions expert. Marines were extensively trained in the use of explosives. The standard issue was the M1 Bangalore torpedo, a long tube filled with explosives used to blow paths through barbed wire. More critical for bunker busting were satchel charges, canvas bags filled with C2 or Composition C explosive, and pole charges, explosives on the end of a long pole that could be thrust into the firing ports of a bunker. The use of explosives was methodical and final. Where a flamethrower might force a temporary withdrawal, a well-placed satchel charge would obliterate the position and everyone in it. This reliance on high explosives reflected the Marine Corps' pragmatic approach. If a position cannot be taken by rifle fire, it must be destroyed completely. This combination of weapons created a specific and horrifying tactical sequence for the Japanese defender. A pillbox would first be suppressed by automatic weapons and rifle fire, pinning the occupants. Then, under this covering fire, a fire team would advance. The flamethrower would hose the emplacement, searing the interior and forcing survivors to the rear or into a state of shock. If the position resisted, a satchel charge would be thrown in or placed, reducing the structure to rubble. Finally, any survivors attempting to flee would be cut down by rifle fire or a shotgun. This was a systematic, almost industrial process for neutralizing defensive works. It was the opposite of the human wave attacks or individual heroics that characterized Japanese tactics. For the Japanese soldier, this method of warfare was deeply unsettling. It felt impersonal and cruel. They were not being defeated in a fair fight of bayonet against bayonet. They were being systematically burned and blown out of their positions by technicians of violence. The weapons themselves, the fire, the scattering shot, the obliterating explosions, struck at a deep, psychological level that bullets did not. The Marines' willing and proficient use of these tools cemented their reputation not as honorable warriors in the Japanese conception, but as ruthless and terrifying exterminators. This was not a contest of spirit. It was a process of annihilation, and the Marines were its masters. The conflict in the Pacific was characterized by a level of brutality and racial animosity that far exceeded the war in Europe. This was not a clash between different branches of Western civilization. It was a war between two peoples who saw each other as racially and culturally inferior. This mutual hatred permeated every level of the conflict, from high command down to the individual rifleman, and it created a battlefield where quarter was rarely given and the rules of war were often abandoned. For the Japanese soldier, this racial context framed the Marine not just as an enemy, but as a monstrous subhuman, which in turn justified and amplified their own brutal behavior. The roots of this racial hatred were deep. On the Japanese side, it was fueled by decades of propaganda centered on the concept of Yamato Damashi and the divine nature of the Japanese people. They viewed other Asian peoples as inferior and extended this contempt to Westerners, whom they saw as soft, materialistic, and individualistic. American soldiers and Marines were referred to as devils and beasts. This dehumanization was a deliberate tool to strengthen the soldiers' resolve to kill without remorse. The infamous treatment of Allied prisoners of war, from the Bataan Death March to the conditions in prison camps, was a direct consequence of this ideology. A soldier who surrendered was already beneath contempt, and a captor who believed his prisoner was subhuman felt no obligation to adhere to the Geneva Conventions. The American side was equally steeped in racism. Decades of yellow peril propaganda, caricatures in the media, and a general cultural ignorance fostered a view of the Japanese as a fanatical, insect-like horde. Following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which was viewed as a treacherous act, and the revelations of Japanese atrocities, this racism became official and widespread. The US government's propaganda machine, including films, posters, and cartoons, consistently depicted the Japanese as buck-toothed, bespectacled, and less than human. This was not the same as the European portrayal of Germans as misguided or evil, but as a fundamentally alien and monstrous race. This atmosphere created a feedback loop of atrocity and retaliation that made the Pacific War uniquely savage. Marines landing on their first island would have heard stories, often true, of Japanese soldiers feigning surrender only to pull a grenade or booby-trapping their own dead. They saw the mutilated bodies of fellow Marines who had been captured. This created a hard, pragmatic rule among frontline troops: take no prisoners. It was not an official order, but a widely accepted practice born of bitter experience and racial hatred. Why risk your life to capture an enemy who will almost certainly try to kill you in the process, and who you have been taught to see as a vermin to be exterminated? The Japanese, in turn, saw the Marines' refusal to take prisoners and their use of flamethrowers as proof of their bestial nature. Their own propaganda highlighted these acts to reinforce the image of the Americans as cruel and merciless. This confirmed their worldview and justified their own fanatical resistance. Surrender was not an option, not only because of the Senjin-kun, but because they believed they would be tortured and killed anyway, a belief that was often correct. This cycle made the Marines' job even more difficult and bloody. Every position had to be destroyed completely because its occupants would not surrender. For the Japanese soldier, therefore, fighting the Marine was not just a military engagement. It was a racial and existential struggle against a ruthless and powerful devil. The Marine's willingness to use terror weapons, his refusal to abide by the unwritten rules of a clean fight, and his grim efficiency in killing all confirmed the Japanese propaganda. This did not simply make the Marine a hated enemy, it made him a feared one. The Japanese knew what to expect from the Marines, a fight to the finish with no hope of mercy. This knowledge that they were facing an enemy who was just as committed to total annihilation as they were, and who possessed the superior tools to achieve it, generated a unique and potent form of dread, specifically associated with the United States Marine Corps. By 1945, the pattern was set, the reputation sealed. The Battle of Iwo Jima stands as the ultimate expression of the conflict between the Imperial Japanese Army and the United States Marine Corps. It was the culmination of Japanese defensive doctrine and the supreme test of the Marine Corps' combined arms, attritional warfare. The outcome of this 36-day battle provided the final, brutal data point for why the Japanese High Command and its frontline soldiers had come to hate and fear the Marines more than any other Allied unit. The Japanese commander on Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was a brilliant and pragmatic officer who had studied his enemy. He had completely abandoned the failed doctrine of defending the beaches. Instead, he designed a defense in depth. He transformed the volcanic island into a subterranean fortress, constructing a network of over 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of mutually supporting, camouflaged pillboxes and bunkers that were all but immune to naval bombardment. His strategy was simple and grim: force the Americans to pay for every inch of ground with blood. There would be no wasteful banzai charges. Every soldier was to die in his position, having killed at least 10 Americans. This was a plan designed specifically to counter the Marine Corps' method of warfare, by denying them clear targets and forcing them into a grinding war of attrition. The Marine landing on February 19, 1945, was initially met with little resistance, a deeply unnerving silence. Then, when the beaches were crowded with men and equipment, Kuribayashi unleashed his hellish, pre-sighted fire. The entire landscape erupted. Marines were caught in a crossfire from hidden positions on Mount Suribachi to the south and the Motoyama Plateau to the north. It was Tarawa multiplied in scale and horror. Yet once again, the Marines did not break. They pushed inland, and the battle descended into what one historian called throat-shooting war, in a nightmare of wet, fire-blackened, stinking sand. Iwo Jima was the purest demonstration of the Marine as a technical, small unit fighter. The battle was won by fire teams. The assault on Suribachi was a classic example of Marine tactics, isolating the objective, then using tanks, demolitions, and flamethrowers to reduce one position after another. The iconic flag raising on its summit was a tremendous morale boost, but it occurred on only the 5th day of a 5-week battle. The fighting in the northern part of the island, through terrain dubbed the Meat Grinder, was even worse. It was a battle of yards, fought against an invisible enemy who had to be burned or blasted out of the earth itself. The statistics of Iwo Jima are telling. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed and over 20,000 wounded. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died. The Japanese had achieved their goal of a high casualty ratio, but they had lost the island. More importantly, from the perspective of their overall perception, they witnessed the Marine Corps absorb catastrophic losses and continue to advance with undiminished ferocity. The Marines on Iwo Jima displayed a level of endurance and courage that transcended even their own legendary standards. For the Japanese military, the Marine Corps' victory on Iwo Jima under the worst conceivable conditions was the final proof of their unique nature. The US Army fought ferociously in the Pacific, in New Guinea and the Philippines, and was respected. But the Marine Corps was something different. They were the specialists of the amphibious hell. They were the institution that produced soldiers who seemed to be engineered for this specific form of combat, unyielding, technically proficient, and psychologically hardened to the point of numbness. They were the only force that had consistently, from Tarawa to Peleliu to Iwo Jima, proven capable of storming and seizing the impregnable fortresses of the Japanese Empire. The legacy, therefore, was this. The Japanese hated fighting the Marines more than any other unit because the Marines were the most direct and effective instrument of their destruction. They were the face of the industrialized modern warfare that crushed their spirit-based doctrine. They used weapons that inspired primal terror. They fought with a racial animosity that mirrored their own. And they never ever stopped. The Marine Corps did not just defeat the Japanese soldier. It systematically dismantled his entire worldview on the battlefield. In the end, the Japanese hated the Marines for the same reason they feared them. The Marines were better at the kind of war the Japanese had started, and they proved it on 100 beaches, in 1,000 bunkers, and in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima.